My name's Leo Eguchi, and these are my colleagues from Sheffield Chamber Players, Alex Badulov and Sasha Callahan. And I will have another introduction to make in a little bit, but before we talk too much, we thought we might just start with a couple of minutes of music. So we'll talk. I always like to say that, contrary to popular opinion, musicians really like applause. Anytime you want to give it, we'll take it. So what you just heard was the opening aria of Bach's Goldberg Variations. It is 32 measures of music, and it's 32 of sort of the most lovely, poignant music I can imagine. In fact, I would say most composers would probably kill to be able to write just that. But this is a special piece written by a special person. In Bach's hands, this is much more than just a beautiful aria, a beautiful song. It's the genetic material of something that's going to evolve and become bigger and astounding in what it's in the heights it reaches. Okay, so here's how it works. Bach's aria is a beautiful song with a bass line and a middle voice accompaniment. And what he does is he writes variations not on the melody that you heard Sasha play so beautifully, but on my line, on the bass line. He uses it as a sort of a launching point to go in all kinds of different directions, but in a very mathematical and organized fashion I want to get into. So I'd like to ask Alex, if you would, to just play the bass line, the structural notes of the bass line, so you can hear them. It's just 32 notes, as I said. It's sort of 16 and 16 together. And it's just scale fragments, but it really, well, would you mind? Not on the cello. Sounds like a hymn, and of course Bach is responsible for so many of the hymns that we know and love. I just want to say, before we get too far into this, that I'm sure we have many music lovers here who know this piece, and certainly you have your favorite recordings of your favorite pianists. We are obviously not a piano, so we should get that out of the way right away. The piece was written for a double manual harpsichord, so that is to say a harpsichord with 2 keyboards. But it translates very well to piano, and we feel that it translates very well to this arrangement by Dmitri Sidkovetsky for string trio. And I would invite you, as you're listening to the differences between the piano and this string version, I would invite you to use the separation of the lines to be able to follow visually as melodies pass between us. It does a really interesting job of separating out the counterpoint, separating the different layers of voices. It provides a lot of clarity. So, Bach. Bach had a friend, one-time student, who was a German mathematics professor named Lorenz Christoph Mitzler, who was quoted as saying, "Bach's music was the process of sounding mathematics." And his sons, who were famous, Bach's sons, who were famous composers in their own right, they kind of poo-pooed this. They thought that mathematics was dry, but Bach really didn't. He was drawn to it and fascinated by it, and I would even go so far as to say obsessed with it. He was quite taken with numbers and what to do with them. So Mitzler, his friend, created a society of intellectuals that was it was for music and the mathematical sciences to mix. And Bach was indeed a member of that, which I want to talk about in a moment. As I said, numbers were primary to him. He was obsessed with them. You'll find, he was a very religious man. He was devoutly a believer, and when he writes religious music, things happen in threes. 3 sharps in the key signature, 3 flats in the key signature, things occur in threes, sometimes 3 times 3, so it's 9 of something, and this represents to him the Holy Trinity. And this was very significant. It's very consistent in his work. Another example of his obsession with numbers was his name. B-A-C-H, the second letter, the first letter, the third letter. You add them up, you get 14. And when Bach wants to put his signature, his own personal stamp on something, you can find the number 14 there. It might be 14 measures of something, it might be 14 iterations or something. You can, sometimes you have to dig, but it's there. And I would say, and actually along that lines, I'm sometimes skeptical of things like this. When we go digging into somebody's work from the past and we're looking for connections like that. I would just like to say that when Bach joined this society that we're speaking of with his friend Mitzler, they painted a portrait of him, his only portrait that we have, and if you look closely, there's 14 buttons on his jacket. He waited to accept his membership in the society until 13 people had joined so that he could be the 14th person. And the circumstantial evidence is pretty strong. But so this 14 number that becomes his signature, it's not just 14. It might be, he might reverse them because he's, of course, tricky. It might be 41. It might be 9 plus 5. Just, you know, you have to keep your eyes open for these things as you're going. Okay, so what do those numbers have to do with Goldberg? Well, we already discussed that this aria has a bass line with 32 notes in it in 32 measures, 16 plus 16, a binary form where we have a first half and a second half. As you can see from your program, this piece has 32 movements, all of which start on G and end on G, and sort of make this perfect circle that comes around. It's perfectly symmetrical. All of those variations have 32 movements, basically. There's a very notable exception, though, which is number 16, the one right in the middle. It is the one that has a title, Overture. And you may be asking yourself, why is there an overture in the middle? I personally think it's to hammer home the point that this is a new section. This is the halfway point. We're starting Act 2, if you will. And I would say about this one also, it's the only one where the form, the binary form, the first half, second half, is drastically different in the second half. It follows a French overture style, which he wrote many French overtures. But the second half is fast, and because it's a different nature of music, he gives it a different number of bars and puts the repetition sign, the repeat sign, in a very strange place. So when you take the repeats, it actually adds up to 95 measures, 9 plus 5. Again, sort of giving us his stamp that this was on purpose. I made it this way. Okay, so the next thing you'll see when you're looking at the layout of the piece on the program is that there are all these canons. Every third variation is a canon. So what's a canon? If you ever sang Row, Row, Row Your Boat, you sang a kind of a canon. A round is a simple tune where you start and somebody joins you some prescribed amount of time later, and it fits together nicely. And a round has to be very simple because it comes back to the beginning very quickly, and so you can't have too many chords fighting. But with a canon, you don't have to come back to the beginning in the same way. So it affords a lot of possibilities, for example, to fit with this bass line that he is manipulating. So I wanted to ask my colleagues here to demonstrate this for us. Variation number 3 is the first canon. I'm going to ask them to play it for you completely in unison. That is to say, if you could imagine, since we're at MIT, that this is not a melody but a wave, that our wave is completely in phase. It's, everything is going to line up. It doesn't sound like two voices necessarily, it's just one thing on top of itself. So Bach has a lot of possibilities for what to do there. He can shift it over in time by 1 quarter note, which is what I'd like for them to demonstrate now. So that's interesting. It's the same thing, just shifted over a little bit, and it kind of works. Could we shift it 1 more quarter note? So maybe that doesn't work as well. Can we try one more? I think this is an interesting experiment because not all the possibilities are successful, even though they're all perfectly fine. He has infinite options, but he has to make aesthetic choices within the framework that he's set out for him, which in this case are his rules of harmonic language and motion and harmony. Anyways, all choices can be on the table, but not all are aesthetically functional. I want to talk about the word that comes after the word canon in each of those canons. You'll see an Italian counting number after that. The first you heard was canon al unisono, so canon at the unison, which is to say that Sasha starts on the note B and Alex starts on the note B. Literally the same note. The second one, the second canon, variation number 6, is canon alla secunda, so canon at the second, which is a way that we measure vertical distances in music. So in a sense, Bach is going to start operating on these canons not just with time as a variable, but also vertical space as a variable. So what you'll hear, actually, I'm going to ask them to play it in unison first, so you can hear what happens. It will be Sasha on the note. Alex is first on the note G. Sasha's next on the note A. So you'll hear a vertical displacement. That's interesting, right? But you can hear that they're one note apart. They're close, but no cigar. Now, if you guys would play it the way it's written. You can hear the rules and the logic click into place, right? This continues through the piece, canon at the third, canon at the fourth, canon at the fifth, and it keeps coming through this cycle. I would say it's not just the canons that happen every 3. The movement that follows the canon is very consistently a dance movement. The movement that follows the dance movement is very consistently some kind of virtuoso, show-offy kind of flashy piece, and then it brings us back to the canon. So we kind of are spinning about an axis. Now, in fact, I would say, I described earlier that the piece was sort of a perfect symmetrical circle. But it's not exactly two-dimensional, is it? We're sort of rising as we go. So I like to think of this, the whole work, if you take it as its sum, as sort of a slinky that comes back to its start. So it's as if you took the 2 ends of the slinky and put them together. It's not just time and space that Bach is mathematically operating on these melodies, though. He has a lot of freedom. He can take one of those subjects or melodies, flip them upside down, invert them. He can stretch them, make them twice as long, compress them, make them short. He can play them backwards. He can mix any of those options together. I've heard it said that only God can hear retrograde inversion, which is to say, if you take a melody and you flip it upside down and backwards at the same time, no mortal can hear that. We can't take that in, partly because we process time in one direction. It's really difficult for us to be able to capture that in the moment and retain enough to switch it around. But I would invite you to have your ears open and listen for patterns, because I think you'll notice order in fragments and recognize little just bits of things that have a logic to them that remind you of something, even if you can't quite, in real time, do the translation. At least mortals like me can't. So just keep your ears open for I wanted to say one other thing about patterns, particularly about the canons. If you noticed, if you were really, truly keeping score, when Sasha and Alex played the first canon, it is in 12/8 time, which is to say there's 12 eighth notes in every measure, grouped in threes. So it's 4 beats per measure, 3 subdivisions, 3 triplet subdivisions inside of that. The next one is in 3, but mostly made up of double subdivisions underneath that. So as we progress through all of these canons, you'll find that Bach has set himself out a framework to work in. He has 3 options for each. He either writes these canons in 4 beats per measure, 3 beats per measure, or 2 beats per measure. And he either writes the subdivisions of the tunes in eighth notes, quarter notes, or eighth notes, triplets, or 16th notes. So 2, 3s, or 4s on each level, which, if you can kind of construct that Rubik's Cube in your mind, that means that we have 9 sort of permutations we can work through. And we have 9 canons with numbers there. So he exhausts all of his possibilities, and then what does he do for the last one? Variation 30 should be canon at the 10th if you're following his pattern, but it's not. We have this strange Latin word there, quadlibet. What's a quadlibet? It's, this word means basically as you like, what you like. It's a kind of a musical polyphonic joke that Bach used to make with his family. Bach had a lot of children. He had a big family. They were all musical. And when they would have big family dinners or reunions, they would sing these quadlibets together. And it was sort of a musical one-upsmanship where they would see who could put the most interesting songs together. And it didn't have to be art songs or any high music. It would just be a challenge of what you could put together into a funny puzzle. And I want to tell you that when you get to this one, the first tune you'll hear is by Alex, and it was a German folk tune, a vernacular song that people would have known at the time. That the lyrics of which translate to, "You've been away for so long, come back, I've missed you so," which is a very nice sentiment. Then it's answered by a song, the lyrics of which translate to, "Your cabbages and turnips have driven me away. If you had only cooked meat, I would have stayed." And there are at least several other fragments of melodies there that perhaps people at the time would recognize. I don't, and they've basically been lost to history, although we have some ideas of what they could be. But I think it is, I think it's wonderful that Bach, having exhausted the constraints and the rules that he set out for himself at the beginning with this, he wants to close this off with comedy, with humor, and with a chuckle before he closes the circle. So with that, I'd like to introduce MIT's Markus Buehler. He's the professor, the Jerry McAfee Professor in Engineering and the head of the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering. And Markus is going to, what's the stipulation? Okay, thanks. Markus is, he's a material scientist, but you'll find very quickly he has a mind for many things, including music. And as I was weighing this project of bringing Goldberg here and making a conversation about it, I heard about Markus's work taking proteins and turning them into sound, and then introducing variation. And I thought, I gotta meet this guy. So I wondered, Markus, if we could start with that research, if you wouldn't mind just giving us an introduction about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So thank you very much, Leo, for inviting me, and nice to meet you all. So I'm going to briefly talk about proteins, and how many of you know about proteins? Heard about proteins, right? So let's do a little introduction. So proteins are really the basic building blocks of all of our human body. Our skin is made out of proteins, our cells are made out of proteins, our hair, our heart, our organs. And proteins are encoded by DNA. So the DNA basically is a code of letters that gives a sequence of what we call amino acids. Many amino acids make a protein. And you can imagine, this is why I brought this little string. I have a couple of demonstrations since we're at MIT. We're going to learn about strings, string theory, and we're also going to learn about mechanics in a moment. Exactly, strings, yeah, exactly. Yeah. So when the cell makes the protein, oh, I'm so sorry. I'm trying to speak up. So when the cell makes the protein from the DNA, it basically takes the DNA letters and encodes a sequence of amino acids. And they're kind of like a string. Amino acid 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they kind of line up in a string like this. Now when the protein is produced, to become functional, it has to fold. So it has to fold in a shape like this, or it has to fold in a helical shape, it kind of looks like this, or it might fold into really complicated three-dimensional shapes. And what we have done in the work on translating the protein to music is basically thinking about how would each of these amino acids sound like. If you go and look at the amino acids, they're quantum mechanical objects. So they have, at the quantum level, things are at the same time a wave and a particle. So you can actually calculate the vibrational spectrum of each of these building blocks, and you can make them audible. And if you were to play them, you would create the baseline melody of the aria, as an example, as an illustration, without any variation. But when the protein folds, of course, this melodic pattern, this basic melodic material, is reassembled in space and in time. And the way this sounds like is basically you get rhythm, you might get overlays of melodies, counterpoint, and you might get some really interesting musical effects. So in the work we've done, we've explored how we can utilize the basic language of DNA translated to amino acid sequences, translated to three-dimensional protein structures, and make it audible and explain how various musical concepts can be actually rediscovered in the folding of proteins.
We have a musical example of this, if you guys would like to hear it. But you just have to give me a second, because I discovered my speaker turned itself off. Could you explain to us more of what we're hearing?
Right, so it's a little complicated, but in simple terms, what you hear is basically the folding process. So if you imagine this string, if you were to play this basic melody would sound like in the beginning of the aria by itself. When the protein folds, one end basically begins to overlay on the other end, and you now create, if you imagine following this protein from one end to the other, you're going to hear the notes played. Actually, I'm going to show it like this, using gravity, makes it easier. You're going to see that the notes played in the beginning here now, at this point, begin to overlap with the notes from the neighboring protein chain that is close by because it has folded and become geometrically close. So that's what you heard in the background. You heard multiple melodies overlapping. You also heard that in some areas of the protein, and this is a little hard to create here, but the protein is folded, let's say, in a helix. And so you're going to hear some additional rhythmic elements. When there's a helix, the notes are going to progress much more quickly. And you can actually reconstruct a lot of these ideas that you introduced in the variation of the Bach used to create the 32 or 30 variations of the piece, I actually utilize my proteins as well in a real physical system. And you can really go and almost one by one rediscover some of those musical concepts that have been used through the centuries and the ideas that nature has used to create proteins and make them functional.
So what happens? Let's say you go in and you introduce variation. Are you just swapping one letter of amino acid for another?
Yeah.
And if so, what happens?
So variation or conservation of structure is really, really important in proteins. The reason why we're all alive here is because proteins are conserved. We have proteins that are in our skin and our bones, that even though we all have slightly different genetic material, they have the same basic pattern material. So they have the same basic idea at its core. And that's how these proteins fold and function. But each of us has slight variations, and so the variations, most of the variations we can introduce are harmless, and they basically render the protein still functional. They have a slightly different shape, and so musically, if the protein has a variation, would sound slightly different. But some mutations, for instance in genetic diseases, will be fatal, and these proteins misfold. You have heard of genetic diseases, and a lot of these have at its origin basically proteins that aren't folded like this, but folded like this, or not folded at all, completely random. And so there's an interesting analogy of how small changes in a sequence, basically changing one note, can actually lead to a fatal destruction of the entire structure. Other mutations, other changes are totally fine, and the protein still folds and actually still has the same function. So there's some really interesting analogies to musical theory, where some mutations, some changes in tones do not change the harmony or only change it slightly. Others are fatal. And sometimes that's a desired subject, of course, but I've
created a few of those fatal changes. So I understand that you can introduce those changes and actually create that protein.
Right.
Your process can go the other direction.
Exactly. So since we have, in the work we're doing on proteins, since we can do the mapping basically from the DNA into the sequence and the folded structure, we can also go the other way, because we've discovered that if you look at the quantum mechanics of how the protein vibrates at the basic level, we can't hear it with our ears. We have to use a model to magnify that. We can hear that each amino acid, each DNA building block has a unique sound. And so if we were to go, we can go one way, like what you heard actually was a real protein that exists in real life. It's part of an organism. And we can sonify that, we can hear that, but we can also go the other way around. We can make new music and make that protein, because we can also translate music back into proteins, right? So we can go both ways. And we've done that as well. So we used ideas of creating new musical compositions and then extracting what are the kind of genetic materials we would need to use to build this protein, and actually made that protein in a test tube. And I should have brought it, because I should have shown, I didn't bring it, but we have the material. Can't see it because it's a molecule, but we have made that. So we have made protein that actually is constructed entirely for music.
And do you know what that protein does?
I don't know. And that's why we're afraid to open the tubes. Actually, one of my postdocs is like, okay.
So maybe it's best you left it.
Best we're going to keep it with Mario.
So can you tell us about this? You've got something else here?
Yeah, there's some other things here. So since we're at MIT, any course 2 or course 1 or course 3 majors or alums or students, some here in the back, yeah. All right, so you all know this. This is an illustration, and when I teach solid mechanics, which is one of the elementary classes for those majors, what you see here is a little piece of material, and I've put some, it's a foam material, so I can easily deform it. And I've put some little lines on there, just straight in the beginning. And basically, if you look at this, you now begin to deform that, I apply a force to this, you can see that it breaks the symmetry. In the beginning, everything is ordered and organized. And the reason why there's no deformation is because there's no forces, no stresses inside the material. Once I bend it, inside the material, we're going to have stresses. And what we have thought about as well, instead of using proteins as a way of thinking about how to create sound and music and composition, to think, can we utilize internal stresses in materials to derive sound? And the way we can imagine is actually, again, with the analogy of strings, when you play the cello or violin, the way you create, when you tune the instrument, you create different tensions in the string, and then you have a different distance at which you pick the string to create different pitches. And similarly in a material, you can imagine each material point has a stress, an internal stress. right? So if you have this, if you do this deformation, on the top, the material is being pulled apart. On the bottom, the material is being squished. You can kind of see that, right? So it buckles on the bottom. And what we do is we basically take this material and walk around in the material and measure the stress inside the material and extract it and apply this stress to a string and pluck the string. And it creates different melodies if we move around. And this is just a simple block. A much more interesting material is a fracture. And as you were explaining in Bach's composition, the Goldberg Variations, one of the beautiful things about it is the symmetry, or the split point between the two halves, or maybe the breaking of symmetry with the last piece. So a fracture is something really important in material science, or in mechanical engineering, or in civil engineering architecture. We want to avoid fractures, but fractures kind of fundamentally are, to me, the basic way of breaking symmetry. And if you look again at this material here now, I've introduced a little crack in here. This is a little fracture, kind of like a crack in your windshield, or a crack in the floor, crack in the building. And if you actually pull this material apart, what happens if you studied material science, mechanical engineering, or mathematics, or physics, you know that at the tip of the crack is a singularity. So the forces inside the material become infinitely large. And they have a certain symmetry. So if you pull this material, no matter what material you have, any crack anywhere in the world, in any material, has the same distribution of stresses. So unlike in the simple bar, where the stresses are very simple, here you have a very complex patterning of stresses. And they are symmetric. If you go around the tip of the crack, go one way and come back the other way, you're going to have the same stresses appear again and again. And what we have done musically, and I think you'll show one of these examples, is to, again, use this fracture as a way to use both completely generatively, completely algorithmically create music by having two movers. We call them movers. One mover moves very far from the crack in a spiral, and you've invoked the spiral in your introduction as well. So we go from far away and kind of go closer and closer into the crack. That's the first mover. As we get closer to the crack, because we're dealing with a singularity, meaning stresses are infinitely large, the variation in pitch becomes larger and larger and more extreme. We have another mover that begins at the tip of the crack and moves to the outside. So those meet in the middle. So in the middle when they meet, basically, they have the same distribution of stresses, and they're symmetric. So the piece basically begins and ends in the same way. But because the stresses vary in very interesting patterns, you create very interesting melodic relationships, just like you were playing. And they're completely algorithmically determined. Now the other thing we can do, instead of using an algorithm, we can actually take these stress fields near cracks and extract little patterns. So just like Bach did when he took maybe a little piece of the melody and compressed it or played it quicker or faster, I can also take a segment here, I can take a segment here, I can take a segment really close, and I can create musical ideas. And the interesting thing about the fracture, because the stress field is universal, and because no matter where I am, there's a mathematical relationship between the distribution of stresses, all the melodies have a relationship to one another. Whether you can hear that or not, or if it's just the overall impression of the piece, we're not sure, but they all have a mathematical relationship through the physics.
I thought we might listen to just a little bit of your fracture music. I'm hearing an order and I'm hearing patterns. I don't know what they mean exactly, but I can sense them. And I wonder, could you explain to us which was the process with the movers to create this one?
Right, so in this case was the one where we basically took, you can hear that in the beginning actually, begins off with the subject, you can call it the subject. And it was basically created by taking a piece of the stress field around. So again, we're loading actually. So if we're not loading, that's another interesting experiment we can do. If we don't apply any loading, the melody would be the same pitch and no rhythmic change. It would be very boring. As we increase the loading, the variation in melody becomes more significant. So we pick a certain loading. And what we've started with is basically a subject that we derived from picking a certain distance, a certain loading, and measuring the stresses as we go around the crack. A little segment around the crack, basically. And then that piece is actually utilized over and over again through the piece, in addition to other ideas that come in. And they use very similar transformations, as you heard talking about the Goldberg Variations, in that we can actually go the other way around. So in a crack, if we go this way, we go forward. We go this way, we go backward. Right? So we can do the similar operation, symmetric operation. We can play it faster, we can play it slower. You heard some of the very quick variations, insertions. Those are created by playing very rapidly. We can go closer to the crack, we can do transpositions. But these are not pure transpositions, these are actually transpositions plus some additional harmonic or melodic additions, because the stress field will vary depending on how close, how far away you are from a single layer. So that's sort of how that piece was created. And it uses a couple of universal patterns that come from the stress field, and it creates music out of that. And the other piece, I don't think we can play that, but the other piece is completely algorithmic, which basically means it's much more boring because it follows just sort of two movers from one end to the other, but it shows you the kind of basic material that's used to create the music.
So I have to say, I find this fascinating, and the proteins fascinating. I think it begs the question, what can you learn from turning this into music? What insights can you glean?
I think for the proteins, we really got to this actually through the proteins, because the proteins are these, I should say there are 20 unique amino acids in our body that nature uses to build anything, all the different proteins. And basically forms a unique scale. We can, as I said earlier, we can sonify that. We can actually understand, if we listen to each of these amino acid building blocks, it sounds different. So what we've been trying to do is to understand the language that nature speaks in creating function. And so similarly, when Bach creates, you mentioned harmony or dissonance or whatever functional requirement in music, in protein science, we have similar patterns. We don't know what they are. And in fact, when we want to design a protein, let's say we want to create a new drug, we want to create a new biomaterial for tissue engineering, we want to create artificial skin, we want to create something to grow cells on. We have 20 letters, and we need to create hundreds or thousands of different letters, combinations, create words, create sentences. We have no idea how to do that, other than watching evolution work, basically. And so what we've been trying to do with music to see, is there another entry point to doing that? Can we, instead of going through just looking at the letters, which if you were to look at the letters, they just look like garbage. I mean, there are 20 different letters, and what are they? We don't understand. It's not a word we can understand. But we thought maybe by listening to them and by using concepts from music theory, compositional techniques, we might be able to actually understand this language and create new proteins from that. And that, as I mentioned earlier, we've done this with making new proteins. We've also used computers to do that. And in many ways, you can teach computers to learn any language using artificial intelligence. And we have actually used the protein music to train an artificial intelligence algorithm to learn how to speak that language. Now, in that case, we don't know what the protein is trying to tell us at all, because all is done by the computer. The computer learns the language, and we say, here's a new protein we want to design, and the computer will design that protein. But the computer understands the relationship between these amino acids, the letters, and what function emerges, like whether the protein becomes a helix, right, like this, like a telephone cord, or it becomes, this is called a beta sheet structure where the protein falls like this, or whether it becomes unstructured completely. And so we begin to see these kind of relationships, we begin to understand that language through the sound, and I think that's something we're very excited about. In addition, I think I'm very fascinated by the universality across different manifestations. So if you think about, not only can we learn how proteins sound like, but also maybe utilize some of the techniques that composers like Bach, brilliant composers, have actually utilized to create music. Can we translate that back into proteins? Because ultimately, we think that the musical ideas that have been developed really are structures that basically resemble things in our brain. If you think about our brain is made from proteins, and in some sort of more prerogative way, you can think if folding of proteins is so elementary to the function, then maybe the creation of counterpoint was really driven innately by trying to express ourselves musically, but creating the same idea, right, that you have in a protein without knowing it. So Bach might have actually told us about protein folding hundreds of years ago without knowing anything about proteins. And that's the angle we take as well in our research, to think about whether we can utilize some of the things that have been created in art, in music, in science, because they tell us something about ourselves without us knowing it.
In reality.
And in reality in general,
We are
maybe,
trying to understand reality, and what you're talking about reminds me of the exhibit of a scientist. His name was Bill Smith, who was a Nobel Prize winner, and through science he couldn't understand reality anymore, and he actually created artistical structure, and there was an exhibit in New York City that was the most advanced expression of the realities that we are all trying to actually come to understand now. So for me, it's historic to see a musician and a scientist come together, because really to understand what's real, we need to unify our cognitive instrument. We've been trained to know reality through our minds or through our emotions, but we need to train those parts of ourselves and unify them so that we can know finally what's real. So thank you.
So, thank you. I think we'll see if, in fact, all of those structures of systems of hierarchy can come together when we play this piece in a few minutes. So, I'd like to say thank you to Markus.
Thank you.